Hi, good evening, everyone. We appreciate you being here tonight. This is the fourth installment in our Global Decisions lecture series. And I know many of you have been tuning in for each installment of the series and attending those that we've had in person. But if you are just joining us tonight for the first time, this lecture series features prominent experts on international security, and they cover some of the more pressing global issues of the moment. And that is absolutely the case with our speaker tonight. Before I introduce him, I just wanted to mention a couple things. First of all, this is a webinar format, and so that means that neither myself nor the speaker can see or hear you. But we do encourage you to interact with the speaker, and the way that you do that is through the Q&A box. You should be able to access that at the bottom of your screen. So while the speaker is talking at any point, all you need to do is open that box up and enter in any questions that you have. When he finishes speaking, I'll take that list of questions and select some of them and read them and have him, you can listen to him answer your questions. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce the speaker. Dr. Jae-Ho Chung is a professor of international relations and political science, and he's the director of the program on US-China Relations at Seoul National University in Korea. Previously, he held appointments at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, as well as the Brookings Institution in the United States, among others. He's also the program chair and the China program coordinator of the Seoul Forum for International Affairs. Professor Chung is the author of 18 books, including he's the author or editor of 18 books, I should say, and those include Between Ally and Partner, Korea-China Relations in the United States, and Assessing China's Power. His most recent book is Centrifugal Empire, Central Local Relations in China, which was published by Columbia University Press. He is the recipient of Seoul National University's Best Researcher Award, the Korean Association for International Studies Best Book Award, and he received the American Library Association's Choice Award in 2017 for Centrifugal Empire. He is a graduate of Seoul National University, Brown University, and he earned his PhD at the University of Michigan. So we are very fortunate tonight to welcome one of the world's leading experts on US-China relations. So Professor Chung, good morning. I believe it's still kind of early there for you, so we appreciate you joining us. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you, Justin. And thank to everyone who's joining in. I really wanted to be there in person, but as you know, I couldn't be there. It was last time I was in Georgia was '89 when I was attending American Political Science Association. So it has been a long time. My thanks to Center for International Trade and Security for having me, and also thanks goes to Justin for inviting me. I'm going to talk about US-China relations and Korea's difficult dilemma in that dynamics today for about 40 minutes. As you all know, US-China relations is the most important geostrategic equation of the 21st century. It will have worldwide impact on so many countries around the world across a wide range of issue domains. My talk today consists of three parts. The first part is my take on US-China relations as a third party to this very important bilateral relationship. And second part of my talk will cover 5 difficult hurdles that China should overcome before it becomes entitled to be called a hegemonic candidate. And then the last part of my talk will cover or discuss Korea's difficult dilemma in this very extreme strategic competition between the two titans. Let me just get into the first part. My take on US-China relations is based upon my research for the last 15 years, as well as my interviews with many American officials and Chinese experts and officials. US-China relations have gone through different phases. Let me cover very important mainstream views about this evolution for the last 40 years. Of course, US-China relations during the 1980s was a very congenial one, although US didn't really view China as a competitor, not even in Asia. So I think China's presence began to be recognized from the 1990s. Of course, back then, still United States saw China as a regional power at best. And China considered itself as a big power, but not necessarily as a strong power. Chinese did have two different concepts for itself during the 1990s. But as we move into the 21st century, situations began to change a little bit. Of course, back then still one superpower and several major powers, that particular structure remained. That is, US was the but the only superpower. There were a couple of major powers like EU, Russia, Japan, and China. But mainstream assessment was that even if China's reform and opening became successful, China will never be able to replace the United States, not only in regional, but also in global stage. And China was pretty much satisfied with the assessment that China could become at least one of the major powers, if not the superpower. However, during the first decade of the 21st century, China's power grew very fast. When we move into the 21st century, in terms of GDP size, China was number 7 in the world. By the end of that decade, that is 2010, China surpassed Japan to become number 2 in terms of GDP in the world. So that means within 10 years, China surpassed Italy, France, England, Germany, and Japan to become number 2. And it was in that period that the academia began to present two sort of perspectives on what China was aspiring to do and what the world has to do about China. One focuses on intentions. In other words, what kind of intention China really has. Is China willing to change the structural and normative field that US has laid out for the last 70 years? In other words, is China a revisionist power? Second one is focuses more on structure. Intentions don't really matter because intentions can change at any time. As long as China grows fast, America's room for strategic maneuvering is constricted. Therefore, whatever China's intentions may be, the United States must guard against and contain China as early and as fast as possible. So these two conflicting perspectives were dominant in the academia. And then as we move into the second decade of the 21st century, China's assertive diplomacy became more distinct, particularly after 2013. That's after Xi Jinping became the General Secretary and President of China. They sort of dropped the principle of strategic modesty. In other words, even if China becomes stronger, China will not become assertive or aggressive. That principle has been dropped. In the early 1980s, China even proposed that China will not seek to become a leader. In Chinese, they call it 不当头. But now that particular tenet has been dropped from Chinese official statements. So China has become more assertive, more aggressive. Now it wants to use its leverages, economic leverages to will influence over countries which stand on the other side of Beijing's preferences. And that sort of coincided with the rise of the Trump administration. So we now see a assertive China, and then the US government, which was determined to contain China. One important consequence of that confrontation was the fast worsening of mutual perceptions. Many surveys, like Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Pew Global Surveys, Harris Interactive, Gallup, as well as in Huanzhou Lebao, Global Times survey series in China, they all illustrate that mutual perceptions between the US and China have become very bad. It's declining very, very fast. So we now see the narrowing of the gap in capabilities of the two titans, as well as the worsening of mutual perceptions between Beijing and Washington. So structurally and perceptually, two great powers are poised to get into the phase of extreme strategic competition. Now, let me say a few words about the Biden administration's China policy, although it has been only 1 year, but it is important to mention that because most of you know more than I do about Trump administration's China policy. So let me just say a few words about Biden's administration's China policy. Initially, it was expected that Biden's China policy would be softer than that of the Trump administration, but that has proved to be wrong. Quite the contrary is true. In fact, strategic confrontation has become more intense. And I think, as President Biden himself said, US-China relations have now come to the stage of extreme competition, if not yet that of conflict. I think there are two major differences between Trump and Biden when it comes to China policy. One, I think while President Trump wanted to push and contain China on its own without really mobilizing the power and energy of the allies and partners. Actually, trade deficit was the worst evil in President Trump's eyes. So it was not just China, but also Japan and Korea, which were having trade surpluses vis-a-vis the US, were also considered as unfriendly. So in pushing China, in containing China, President Trump wasn't really utilizing the benefits of alliances. On the other hand, President Biden's approach is quite different. He wants to build a wide range of coalitions or counter coalitions against China, the most recently AUKUS, and he continues to build up Quad and many others. Second important difference is that President Trump was pushing China by applying sanctions. And in that way, he thought US could benefit economically. But by President Biden's approach, from my third country perspective, is quite different because he wants to invest huge resources into enhancing the competitiveness of the United States. Of course, this remains to be seen. It's only the first year. But, you know, last summer, the Senate passed the USICA, United States Innovation and Competition Act. And last month, the House of Representatives passed a similar bill called US Competes Act. Obviously, there will be a matching bill from the two houses. I don't know what will be the outcome, but if his plan can materialize, thereby enhancing America's competitiveness in basic research as well as applied science, including quantum technology, AI, and so on and so forth, that will be a game changer in my view. If you ask me 3 years, 4 years ago, whose side time is on, I might have said probably China. But now if you ask me the same question, I would say uncertain, because of that, these efforts on the part of Biden administration to enhance competitiveness of the United States. Of course, China is not backing down, despite all those sanctions and containment strategies of the US. China has not been backing down. Of course, China itself has many difficulties to tackle, which will be my next topic. Second part of my talk is about the obstacles or hurdles that China has to overcome before it really becomes a genuine competitor for hegemony or prominence in the world stage. I would say there are 5 hurdles or obstacles. The first one, obviously, is economy, that is, sustained economic growth. China's economy in the last 4 decades has been a miracle, actually, at least in the 30 years from the 80s up to 2013-14, before China begins to decline in economic terms. Many economists talk about the middle income trap. According to the World Bank estimates, 87 of 101 countries which got into the average income range of 10 to 15,000 US dollars, failed to advance to high income status. 87 out of 101 countries. That's high percentage. That means only 14 countries succeeded in advancing into the high income status. That creates a lot of frustration and conflict domestically. And I think China has a full plate in front of it, such as the US pressure for decoupling, overcapacity, aging problems, COVID-19 problems, and so on and so forth, and also the debt, growing debt issues. Whether or not China can overcome these various problems and thereby sustaining economic growth will be a very important critical test for China to be eligible to compete with the US for a hegemonic status. If you look at the forecast of various institutions and think tanks, many have forecast that the China's GDP will surpass that of the US by mid-2020s. Some say 2026, or others say 2027. But most recently, the Nikkei said that has been postponed to 2033. So I guess many experts recognize the possibility that China may not be able to sustain as fast a rate of growth as before. Second problem is the Thucydides trap, which is by now a very familiar concept developed by Graham Allison at Harvard. This is a scenario in which a system-leading nation is likely to engage in a war with a rising challenger to prevent it from taking its place. Of course, this scenario is overly structural, thereby overlooking the importance of perceptions and other various variables. Nevertheless, it offers a very nice metaphor for US-China relations. obviously, if China engages in a war with the US at this point, it will be suicidal, despite the fact that the gap in comprehensive power, national power between the US and China is narrowing. It will be very disadvantageous for China to do so. Of course, it will also impact the US in a very adverse way. But China has not, as I mentioned earlier, China has not been backing down. And many people, many experts say Taiwan will be a very important litmus test, not only for US commitment to the region, but also China's commitment to national unification. So whether or not US and China can really find a way, or whether China can really find a way out of this dilemma, will be an important variable that will determine China's status as a hegemony candidate. Now, third one is what I would call a Kinderburger Dilemma, taken after Charles Kinderburger, who was the professor at Princeton University. According to his one of his theories, World War II was caused by Britain's inability and America's unwillingness or unpreparedness to shoulder global responsibilities, that is public goods, whether it's a security or financial. If you actually look at the data, which is housed at College of William and Mary, the data set is called A-Data. 93% of America's foreign spending is ODA, overseas development assistance, actually helping poor countries. But only 22% of Chinese overseas spending are ODA. The remaining 78% are investment, either direct or indirect. So I guess the US has been much more altruistic than China thus far, at least in terms of overseas foreign spending. Of course, China has been doing this Belt and Road Initiative already for 9 years, which not only extends to the entire continent of Asia, but also to Europe, Latin America, Middle East, and Africa. However, there have been a lot of noises being heard about unequal or debt-related trap diplomacy and so on and so forth. Very negative raps are being made about this Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, there are some good points about that too, but overall, altruistic diplomacy is not as easy as it seems. So unless China can really deliver something for the public goods of the world community, I think it will be more difficult for China to be entitled to be the hegemony candidate. But on this point, I think the jury is still out. Now, the fourth hurdle is the alliance dilemma. Originally, in one of my writings, I actually named it as a Yan problem. Yan taken after Yan Xuetong, who is a professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing, because he initially strongly recommended that China should establish alliances with many countries. But now, Professor Yan changed his position. He's much more reserved about this point. So I dropped his name from this and I just name it as an alliance problem. Basically, the question is this: can China become a global power or global hegemon without allies or alliances? If you look at human history, empires went out and colonized many countries, and those colonies served as allies as well as overseas bases. In the 20th century onward, superpowers set up alliances as well as bases in the countries with which they had very good relations. United States currently boasts 69 allies, and of which 54 are based upon treaties. In 2020, United States has 750 military facilities, including bases in 59 countries. Russia has 25 military bases. They don't really have, I don't really have the data for the facilities, which might be a much higher number. But China doesn't have any ally except for North Korea. North Korea is the only legal ally because China still sustains the treaty of cooperation with North Korea, which is equated as a alliance treaty. But whether or not North Korea can be considered as a genuine ally to China, some people actually have doubts about it. But at least legally speaking, North Korea is the only ally that China has. So can China really become a global power or global hegemon without alliances? This is a very important question because it will also be an indicator with which we can really see whether or not China is going to be a revisionist power. Once China changes its position on non-alliance policy and establish alliance treaties with many countries, then I think we can say for sure that China is now definitely aspiring to become a revisionist power and to replace the US, and then change many of the structural and normative setups made by the United States. China has been insisting on no alliance, as well as no bases, no overseas military bases. But the change has already been made. In 2017, China opened a military base in Djibouti in Africa in 2017. And last year, China opened a second overseas military base in Equatorial Guinea, also in Africa, but on the Western Bank, which actually looks at the Atlantic Ocean, not the Indian Ocean. Djibouti base is facing the Indian Ocean, but the Equatorial Guinea base is facing the Atlantic Ocean. So if history is any useful guide, like many other empires and superpowers before China, China probably should have allies as well as overseas bases to become an eligible candidate for the hegemon. Finally, the fifth hurdle is what I would call the Nye paradox. Nye is so famous for his concept of soft power, right? Soft power is the ability to appeal by way of affection and shared values without using military or economic sanctions. China has been focusing on enhancing its soft power in the last 20-some years. China has been spreading its culture, language, and its own values using various media, including CGTN. CGTN is 24-hour English broadcasting system, as well as Confucius Institute. China uses this as a charm offensive, but many countries nowadays interpret this as influence operations. So all in all, there have been some successes, but also there have been some limitations to these charm offensives. If you look at the Pew Global Survey, Chicago Council on Global Affairs, international communities' perceptions of China are being polarized. Democratic, industrialized, advanced countries have a very negative views of China. On the other hand, less developed, authoritarian, non-democratic countries tend to view China in a more positive light. So I would say soft power is crucial once China's economic power or China's GDP surpasses that of the United States, let's say 2033, I think soft power will play an increasingly important role in determining which power the international community considers to be more influential. Of course, China has a very big homework to do. That is, what kind of alternative norms China will come up with. The United States has already been a champion of free market, democracy, and human rights. Not that the United States is perfect on all three accounts, but at least China, US has been trying hard to champion these causes. But what alternative norms China can develop to replace this? It will be a very, very daunting challenge for China. Now, finally, let me talk about Korea. Since two powers, US and China, are engaged in such a serious competition, confrontation, if not yet a outright conflict, third parties, many countries, particularly in Asia, are having trouble to make their stance explicitly known because if you stand on the US side, China will use its economic leverage to sanction. For instance, in 2016, Korea and the United States, in a joint alliance decision, deployed a THAAD system, which is a anti-missile defense system. But China used various pretexts and opposed to the deployment. And once we deployed it, China employed a wide range of sanctions against Korea in 2017 onwards, and they are still continuing up to today. So economic sanctions are important because Korea is so much dependent upon trade and investment. And Korea's trade with the United States and Japan combined is still smaller than Korea's trade with China. So I think for one, the United States must enhance its economic capability and relevance to the region. As far as China's share of trade and investment for the region is bigger than that of the United States, it will be difficult for countries to completely in line with America's stance when it comes to China. And second, Korea has its own difficulties. For instance, on the issue of reunification. As you know, Korea is a divided country. But because of the various historical conditions, China does have certain rights to speak about the Korean Peninsula. For instance, under what conditions the unification will be made, and so on and so forth. So for us, at least we should prevent China from playing a veto card, so that we have to be careful and very, we have to play a very smart game. Second, as I mentioned earlier, China's economic leverage is so important. Our GDP is dependent, at least 25% dependent on China's trade. United States about 13%. So as long as China uses its economic leverage, it will be very difficult for us to be completely opposed to what China wants to do. Third important issue is democratic pendulum, that is in my own term. In other words, Korea is a democracy. Korea elects presidents every 5 years. So who becomes the president and represents which party, which political, which part of the political spectrum will have a different policy propensities. So it goes to one extreme and to the other next time. So it might be seen as inconsistent, but I think that's the price that you have to pay as a democracy. And of course, this is not good in terms of enhancing the trustworthiness of a country when it comes to foreign policy. And I really think this has to be corrected in the longer run, but at least this is the problem that we have. So let's say a conservative party takes power, it will have very strong propensity to strengthen the alliance relationship with the US at the expense of Korea-China relations. But as we have seen in the last 5 years, non-conservative party takes power, then they tend to get closer to China at the expense of Korea-US relations. So this pendulum cannot be avoided as long as Korea adopts a democratic system. I hope my friends in the United States can understand these side effects of democracy in terms of foreign policy issues. Finally, I think there is an alliance factor. As I mentioned earlier, 2017 onwards, China has been implementing these sanctions, economic sanctions against Korea over the deployment of THAAD. Now, as an military ally, based upon the alliance treaty, United States should have done something to help us. But United States didn't do anything. Not because US didn't want to do it, but because the military alliance can do little to economic sanctions. When China applies sanctions, US cannot use military power to help us. So this is a very strange limitations to the military alliance. And I think China has carved out a very nice loophole of the alliance, which has become vulnerable to economic sanctions. So this has left quite an important trauma on the minds of Korean people, both elites and the general public. What the alliance can really do when we're in trouble. So this is what the US and Korea should sit together and think through, because this will not be the China sanctions over the THAAD deployment will not be the last. It will be just the beginning of a long series to come. So, and last point, I'm running a couple of meeting tracks with American friends, Japanese friends, and German colleagues as well on China policy. They are all sort of wondering why Korea couldn't do things like Australia did or Japan did. Well, I think there are very important differences. If Korea is located in a place like Australia is several thousand kilometers away from China, we probably could do it more easily. But it's not that easy. Geographical proximity is a very difficult issue to resolve. Second, Japan and Korea are very different. Japan is a huge economy. Let me show you one data. Korea's trade constitutes only Japan's foreign trade constitutes only 29% of GDP. So only 30% at most. But in terms of Korea, 70% of GDP is from trade. We are much more vulnerable. Okay. Even though Japan's trade dependency on China is 21%, our trade dependence on China is 24%. If you look at only these two data, Korea and Japan look very similar. But if you look at the trade and GDP structure altogether, it's very different, very different. And also Japan buys more from China than sells to China. It's a 45 to 55. But Korea sells to China more than we buy from China. So this trade structure difference makes it more difficult for Korea to follow suit what Japan or Australia have been doing. Of course, this does not justify all the policy stances that were taken in the last 5 years, but there are at least some structural differences there. So because of this extreme confrontation, competition between the two titans, many countries in the region, not just Korea, but many countries are having a serious dilemma of having to make a side, take a side, or walking the tightrope. And I think that will continue. And let me stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. Those was some great insights. To the audience, go ahead and put your questions in that Q&A box there at the bottom of the screen, and we can go ahead and read those to Professor Chung whenever you're ready. I thought I would sort of kick it off, Professor, and ask you the first question, if you don't mind. You mentioned at towards the beginning of your talk, the sort of the problem of public opinion, particularly in the United States, as it relates to China. You mentioned the Pew survey and some of the other survey results that have recently shown that opinion regarding China has soured in the last couple of years. And then you also suggested that maybe part of the reason for that was that the Trump administration kind of accelerated that deterioration in public opinion. I was wondering if you think that the opposite might be possible. Is it, with public opinion having deteriorated to the point that it has within the American public, is it possible for American leadership to reverse that trend, or has that effect already kind of been formalized?
I didn't really mean to say that it was a Trump administration which really made American public's perceptions of China bad. I think it is probably a part of it, but more importantly, I think it was what China has been doing, particularly since 2013, because China has been doing things since then very differently from what they had been doing from the 1980s. China has become assertive, aggressive, and China has been using its economic leverage to retaliate against those who stand on the other side of China, except for the US. Actually, they've been sanctioning almost all countries except for the US. US is the only exception. UK, France, Canada, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, most recently Lithuania, and so on and so forth. Whether big or small, they have been sanctioning because most of the countries in the world are economically closely related to China. Most of the countries in the world either have China as either number 1, number 2, or number 3 trading partner. So China has been using this influence or instrument at will. And I think that has created a lot of negative sentiments, not only in other countries, but also in the United States. And particularly if you look at the American public's perceptions about Tibet and China's attitude toward fair trade and so on and so forth. I think it's not just the Trump administration, but probably what China has been doing, particularly since 2013. Whether or not American leaders can actually reverse that, I'm not quite sure, because the main variable was not the political leadership in the US, but what China has been doing. So unless China changes the behavior, that perception is not likely to change very easily.
That makes sense. I get a question from the audience here. Let's see, in 2018, the National Defense Strategy for the United States reoriented the US towards competition with Russia and China. Do you think that it's the right decision or a useful decision to treat those two countries in the same category as major competitors?
Well, if you look at the documents from the Trump administration, I think they seem to think China and Russia in a more or less the same category. But if you look at the documents from the Biden administration from last year up until last month, I think China seems to take a position which is a bit higher than that of Russia. So I would say Biden administration seems to think China poses a more serious threat to the United States. If you look at if you agree to the fact that economy is the most important variable, then I would say definitely China is more serious threat, because Russia's economic capability is far smaller than that of China. Without strong economy, it will be difficult for Russia to sustain the military competitiveness for very long. On the other hand, China, despite all those problems that I mentioned, China still boasts 5.5% to 5.8% of annual growth in GDP. Plus technological advances. As you may know, China has published more, registered more patents regarding AI than the United States as of last year. So this technology and economy combined, China has really a serious competitiveness vis-a-vis the United States that Russia doesn't really have.
Thank you. Let's see, another question here says, American politicians often talk about the need to compete better with China, but there is often a lack of clarity in how we do this. Is it possible to improve relations with China while also simultaneously competing with them?
And so you could improve relations while competing when the two parties have a certain level of mutual trust. Because good friends can compete at the same time have friendship. But I'm not quite sure whether at this point the United States and China really have mutual trust, without which competition will always proceed. So on that respect, I mean, in that respect, I am, as a third party to the relationship, a bit more pessimistic.
Well, I mentioned to you before we started tonight that we were likely to get a question like this. What is the impact of the current crisis in Ukraine on America's relationship with China?
Well, I would say, as I mentioned earlier, under the two-city death trap, I mentioned China doesn't want to get involved in a military dispute at this point. China wants to wait for more years. That is, before it, it wants to become stronger when it wants to get involved in military dispute. So that is to say, a lot of people compare the Ukraine situation to Taiwan contingency. Okay, so in other words, when Russia wants to reoccupy parts of Ukraine, or back in 2014 Crimea, that was compared to the Taiwan contingency, in which China wants to retake Taiwan as part of its territory. Therefore, it will be very supportive of Russia. But in fact, if you listen to what Foreign Minister Wang Yi said in the Munich Security Conference, he was very sober, very neutral. He emphasized that everybody should respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any country, meaning Ukraine. So, China doesn't want this whole thing developing into a military conflict, which will not only have an adversary impact on the global economy, but also make China's position more difficult.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. So let me just ask you, I believe you have a presidential election coming up. Is it next month? Is that right?
Right.
Do you have any predictions or thoughts you'd like to share with us, especially in terms of what we might expect in terms of US-Korea relations?
Well, I do have my own preferences, but I cannot disclose them. But 2 weeks left. 2 weeks, I would say, is a long time in Korean politics. I don't know about American politics, but it's a long time in Korean politics. Anything can happen. But I can say this for sure. Now we have, out of 14 candidates, we have 2 major party candidates. Incumbent party candidate, which represents the progressive spectrum. He already mentioned quite a few times he will inherit most of foreign policy positions of the current government, particularly when it comes to North Korea and China. So, if he is elected, we'll probably see the, season 2 of what we have seen for the last 5 years. On the other hand, the opposition party candidate is elected. His foreign policy advisors have already stated that focus will be on re-strengthening the alliance and readiness of the joint forces of the Korean-American militaries vis-a-vis North Korea. And when it comes to China, they say they will drop the what we call the 3 no policy, which was made under the Moon Jae-in government. 3 no policies: no additional THAAD system, not joining America-led ABM system, and then not developing Korea, US, Japan trilateral security cooperation into a trilateral alliance. This was a promise that Moon Jae-in government gave to China in 2017. And I think this will be dropped once the opposition party candidate is elected. So when it comes to China policy, I think we see quite a big difference between the two candidates, which has a very significant ramifications for Korea-US relations as well.
Right, and as you pointed out, that may be the price of democracy. Well, these are all excellent insights, and we appreciate your time with us tonight, Professor Chung, and thank you to all of you in attendance tonight. I do want to just quickly mention our last lecture of the season is on March 16th. That's Rachel Myrick from Duke University. She's going to be speaking on polarization in American foreign policy, and that will be virtual. again. So we'll hope you turn out for that. And as always, you can always follow our activities and events and things that our faculty and staff are doing through our various social media accounts. So make sure to follow those. So one more time, just want to say thank you, Professor Chung, for your talk tonight and for such a great discussion. And thanks again to all of you. Hope you have a good evening.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thanks.